In Fire Emblem Heroes, or I guess with any gacha, it's expected that units will eventually come and go with time and inevitable power creep. However, it's not outside the realm of possibility for something to last longer than expected, whether it's due to having a niche that has yet to be fully power crept or even attempted in any capacity. And with FEH having well over 1200 playable units in the game, it's no shocker that at least some would end up fitting into that mold. That said, given the current state of the game, it's pretty impressive that there's even a good amount of units worth highlighting to begin with. So with that being said, let me take you through a history of Fire Emblem Heroes' best aging units. One thing that should be worth keeping in mind is that at any point in time, IS can very much just release a new unit, skill, or effect that completely makes any of these units I mentioned in the video irrelevant, and they've had a long history of doing such a thing. So while I do think this is a more or less comprehensive list of the most relevant stuff to the topic, it should be noted that there's a chance that something in the video will end up aging poorly, which it's kind of ironic given the topic. Every unit that you'll see on this list has been extremely good for at least a considerable amount of time, and if you know anything about the current state of the game, then it won't come as a shock when I start with the most expected unit on the list in Freyr. It's really no surprise that Freyr is the first unit on this list, as he's arguably the best aging unit in the entire game. Ever since his inception, he's dominated most of Aetherraid's defense because he's been able to negate all penalties at the start of each turn to himself and allies within 2 spaces of him. Freyr was in response to a unit that similarly dominated the game at one point in Elamine, but if you want more information on that, then I highly recommend watching this video, but after this one, of course, you gotta watch this one first. However, the implications of Freyr effectively changed Aetherraids as a whole. There was realistically no way to take advantage of start of turn debuffs as long as he was around, which continues to remain relevant to this day. We've had more recent additions in Attune Micaiah and Ninja Cyrilou who both can similarly cleanse penalties, but only up to 2 total as opposed to Freyr's unlimited amount. And it's because of this that people still choose to run him instead, despite having less general utility, even on seasons where he doesn't belong. Likewise, I don't think the developers want to give out any more units that cleanse as much as he does, seeing as Micaiah and Cyrilou only cleanse 2 at most, as that would cause even further implications for the game. Yet, as start of turn penalties continue to get stronger, it only makes sense that he ends up being as common as he is on his own season, as well as on the opposite season, purely for the cleanse. I can't claim he's good game design per se when an anima-based mythic ends up dominating both anima and dark season, but he's unfortunately a really necessary evil to the game at this point, and we've been getting mid-turn debuff stuff as of late, so it's not impossible to penalize the foe either. However, he's still there to ensure that the most busted of penalties don't go through, and until they drop mid-turn penalties that outright make him worthless, he's going to most likely remain relevant for the rest of the game's lifespan. And perhaps the best part of all of this, he's going to get buffed in the future since he's due for an update next year. I can't imagine it'll be that much, but the fact that this isn't even his full potential at the moment speaks volumes to it all. If there's a takeaway from any of this, it's that Intelligent Systems doesn't know how to properly balance their game, and that's why we're here. Next, we have Bride Catria and Winter Cordelia. I think these two were also expected units to show up on the list for good reasons, but I think their inclusions are far more interesting than it's being led on. Both of them give out a status that enable any unit to get the Brave effect in the player phase, which has historically been one of the strongest effects in the entire game. Bride Catria was initially a response to tank meta and allowed all sorts of units to keep up with it, but as the arms race between nuking and tanking kept going back and forth, the demand for units like Catria and Cordelia kept faltering as a result. Their entire relevancy has always been in direct response to tank meta. If newer units can manage by themselves, then Catria and Cordelia don't end up having a place in the meta and they fall off, but when a lot of nukes also depend on them, they end up making a grand return. It's why they currently see usage in modes such as Aetherraid's offense and Summoner Duels, because even some of the best nukes in the game can't really manage without them. And it's why they'll most likely lose relevance again down the line and potentially crop up again then after. But I think that's what makes them much more interesting than any other unit that will probably be on this list or mentioned in any capacity because of how they respond to meta shifts. And with newer Brave enablers such as Ice Tribe Thea and Desert Marissa, there's a strong possibility they'll end up aging just as well in the end. And in conjunction with the aforementioned support units, here's another support unit in Summer Thor. Summer Thor is interesting because unlike Freyr and the Brave enablers, Thor really mostly shined in Summoner Duels, yet her support was still useful for Aetherraids at one point. Her weapon inflicted penalties that made foes take 10 extra damage per hit, and reversed any movement bonuses on top of having a C-slot that allowed allies to charge her specials way faster. And her weapon is still great for penalty stacking, yet it's not the thing that's kept her relevant for this long. It's her duo button. Her duo button removes every single bonus on all foes within 5 rows and 5 columns centered on her, which should tell you immediately why she's still used in summoner duels. A lot of units rely on bonuses to function, so having a unit that can remove them at any point during a turn is invaluable, even if it's only once per map, and that's still in conjunction with her weapon penalties as well as all the flyer skills she could take advantage of. Her button was effectively a non-factor even way back then, just because everybody was running duels hindrance and eighth raids by that point. In fact, buttons were effectively a non-factor unless it was for Gale Force teams specifically, which she never really found herself on, nor was her button really that useful for the role itself. And by this point, she doesn't really contribute to most modes except summoner duels just because of the button, but it's so good that she's still worth using even nearly 3 years later. The most competition, quote unquote, she had was with Nurgle, who currently doesn't work these days, and Mythic Loki, who similarly cleanses bonuses, but only at the start of the turn with lesser range, and if the foe has at least 3 of them. But that's not to discount her either, since she's also extremely strong in summoner duels currently, and they never really competed with each other either, because if there were just a bunch of bonus cleansers, they're all ran on different teams at the end of the day. And to Thor's credit, she can use it any time during a turn, whereas Loki has to use it at the start of the turn, so it can help against mid-turn bonuses. Suffice to say, Thor still has her place, and it will probably stay that way for a very long time. Similarly, while not as potent, Desert Lint has held up considerably well for summoner duels, and is still one of the units that many people will go to when the season calls for it. Lint's claim to fame back in the day was nullifying trenches in any terrain that slowed down movement, which allowed cav lines to thrive considerably on top of easy no follow-up access. She also had a decent harmonic button in combat at the time, which isn't really the thing most people use her for these days beyond stalling actions. And while the null terrain status doesn't come up too often just because a lot of maps don't have trenches, in the event that there's an SD map with trenches on it, she tends to be the first unit people go to and is extremely important for specific teams to really function at the end. That said, we do have considerably better units nowadays that can do the same thing, such as Oder and Arlen, the former also having significantly better combat to boot. Yet the main purpose has always been the null terrain, so while there are better options, Lynn still does her job considerably well, and that's why she still has a place. Granted, it is season dependent, but she still does what she needs to do in the end. Also, most people only owned Lyn, so... And on the topic of cav lines, I'd be remiss not to mention Mythic Dagger. Post-Refine Dagger made her into a fantastic unit for any cav line team, since she can naturally extend the range of most teammates by 2 spaces thanks to her double Pathfinder. She not only has it built into her weapon, but can give it to an ally, which is great for getting in the foe's face whenever needed. It's fairly straightforward in nature, and so potent that they ended up releasing an updated version with extra support gimmicks on top of it. However, Mythic Dagger isn't entirely out of a job, since the new one has her Pathfinder support built into her B slot, which means she can't lean into her combat as much as the other one. And while I wouldn't say her combat is considerably impressive, it's still an angle she can lean into that the new one can't. But the biggest contribution, similarly to Lind, albeit a bit more applicable, is cav line support, which is what you'll be using her for the most. And if you noticed up to this point in the video, all of the units mentioned were ones that provide support, and for a really good reason. Support tends to age better than combat, in part due to slower ceiling increases or there being a valuable niche that doesn't get power crept for a long time, if ever. However, the next unit on this list will be the only purely combated related unit on the list. That unit being Brave Crom. Brave Crom, I think, is one of the rare exceptions in the game where a unit's combat is so good that it ends up getting stronger over time. The weapon itself is more or less the usual tank busting stuff in armor effectiveness, a bunch of stats, special manipulation, true damage, so on and so forth. However, the biggest thing carrying Brave Crom to this day is his assist in a Fate Changed, which allows him to not only get an extra action, but allows him to copy any bonus status off the ally he uses the assist on. This means when IS drops new exclusive bonuses that were intended for a specific unit, Crom can take it and use it for himself, which includes the recently added Gallop status that grants 2 extra movement, allowing him to move 5 spaces at once. From his inception, mention, everybody knew he was going to age extremely well, as newer bonuses would continually keep him relevant. Not to mention, being able to take extra actions with an assist tends to age well because it's a useful gimmick for summoner duels. However, I don't think many people expected him to last this long, and there's really no sign of him falling off currently since he's a phenomenal armor buster with so many capabilities for combat and strategies. I think unless we end up getting a unit that's just Brave Crom but strictly better, or they release enough stuff into the game that prevents him from using his assist, he's not really gonna go anywhere. And for a combat unit, that's really impressive. I do also want to bring mention to 3 other mythics that haven't really aged all too much in Emblem, Not, and Sather. Embla's in a weird spot because while she definitely needs an update to keep her up to speed, she still has niche use cases because of her undefended support, which effectively disables saves from protecting the unit the status hits. I think similarly to Bride Katria and Winter Cordelia, its use case wholly depends on how dominant specific armors are in the game, on top of what kind of map she's deployed on. It is a unit that was designed for Aether Raids that works better in summoner duels, funnily enough, but some layouts allow her to thrive significantly. By effectively removing any protection, you can go in and deal with some of the more manageable units on a specific team. If anything, it's more akin to desert lanes where the right map makes them thrive, and what they do is still plenty useful. And while we do have a better version of Emblem with better combat and more support, she can do what she needs to do in the end. The most she'll need are allies that can make the penalty stick so it doesn't get cleansed by a bunch of other stuff. Meanwhile, Not has always been a generally useful dark mythic because she granted Pathfinder, granted only to herself unlike Dagger, but could frontline, enable extra deployment slots for Aether Raid's defense, and could run Canto control. She's never really fallen off per se, even if she isn't on every defense team, but is probably the most consistent dark mythic in the entire game purely due to her role compression. The Pathfinder, and to an extent the added refund she got, still makes her super useful with some team compositions. She's not Freyr levels of dominant, but she does have a lot of stuff for one unit, and that's allowed her to remain generally useful for as long as she's been out, which is a really remarkable feat. And then there's Sather, and she's still absurdly strong even after 2 years, and I don't put that lightly. Sather, in my opinion, is the strongest offense mythic in the entire game, purely because of her ability to shut down a foe's action despite it only working on odd turns. Ending actions is still extremely strong for Aether Raids despite the existence of Firm Cancel Curb, which was designed to stop that effect, just because the skill is not really that common. Not to mention, with the recent buff to Safe Defense 2, you can prevent foes from moving in for the first 2 turns, and then prevent a unit from moving in on turn 3 with Sather. So she ends up pairing extremely well with most teams, even on turn 1 Gale Force teams, since all she has to do is teleport in and end whichever remaining unit exists on the field. It's extremely ideal for Aether Raids pot collecting as well, and the only other unit that could really do what she does is herself. The New Year's version is significantly stronger since it works on any turn, and she has better combat, but it also requires a slot on a team, whereas the Mythic version has no opportunity cost. Both are still remarkably broken for Aether Raids, and that single bit of utility does so much in the end that I wouldn't hesitate to call her the best offense Mythic currently. That said, I would also understand people saying Plumeria and Peony are the best ones, but it's also worth the discussion, and that speaks volumes to me. And speaking of which, the last unit I want to mention, while not the best dancer these days, can still be really useful in New Year's Peony. I don't think that many people clamor to her these days for much of anything, yet her niche is still really good for Gale Force purposes. She can still dance 2 times in 1 turn, which can only be replicated by the recently released Spring Plumeria for Aether Raid's offense Gale Force purposes, as well as a couple of other specific harmonics, but that's not as flexible since it requires specific units to get the dance off. A dancer that can dance 2 times in 1 turn can still fulfill a good niche, even if that's all she does. That said, it really is locked to Aether Raid's offense and PvE content, but that's better than most units at the end of the day, especially ones that are over 4 years old at this point. I did have other stuff I wanted to mention, but it was too broad in scope for the most part, so here's the special mention segment. Melee armors. They are a special mention because of how incredibly busted armor skills are, as well as how reliant everybody is on saviors. They have great skills that allow almost any kind of melee armor to function at a high level, even in the most competitive modes. Dancers, they dance. I think that one's very self-explanatory. Dancing is pretty good. Emblem units. Well, mostly the ring effect since they're free buffs for any unit, so even when the unit themselves falls off, the ring will most likely still remain really good. Attuned Micaiah. I wanted to have her on the list initially, but she was not that old, all things considered, so I decided not to put her on it. I don't think I really need to explain why a unit that's good at debuffing, cleansing, having generally good support, and decent combat is a really good thing. And Mythic Loki. She's currently a really strong unit for Summoner Duels, but recently got fantastic buffs that make her support stronger in Ice Lock Plus that allows her to set down any sort of breakable terrain and take another action, as well as Call to Serve that lets her give out even more support with true damage and bonus nullification. There's also other units that I think will end up aging well, but this one's way more speculative, but hear me out. Leyrother. He inflicts a bunch of penalties and makes foes into save units, so it's hard to determine whether that niche will ever really fall off. It's just really good for sniping units that just aren't protected by saves at that point. Mythic and New Year's Hathran. They provide a lot of amazing support and free actions on assists, so they'll naturally last a good while. Desert Marissa and Ice Tribe Thea. As mentioned earlier with Bride Catria and Winter Cordelia, Brave Enablers are really good. The former is also just a really stronger version of Catria, and the latter doesn't really need to rely on any statuses. Fiatzi. Being able to grant Pathfinder and inflict gravity on foes at the start of the turn and after an action shouldn't really age at all, if not just slightly poorly, and it's still extremely strong at the moment, especially in Aether Raids. And Nurgle and Sonya. This is assuming the two units that completely make them irrelevant are forced out of the meta, because once they are gone, there's a good chance that Nurgle can make a comeback and Sonya could become meta for the first time ever. However, this is the most speculative part of the video, so I would take this with a grain of salt. That said, a lot of the ones we do currently have that I at least mentioned are still really good, and other than that, that's really about it. Considering how fickle the lifespan of units are these days, it's pretty cool seeing units that can maintain their usability after a long while. And I'm sure there's more units like that out there or could potentially end up like that, so if you think I missed anyone or should have mentioned anything in the video, then let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, then make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.